Welcome to the Midnight Lesson. If you're watching this late at night, or you've put this on in the background while you rest, I'm glad you're here. These lessons are made for slow hours and quiet rooms, the kind of time when your brain can finally unclench and just listen. And before we begin, I want to ask you something. If you have ideas for future topics, drop them in the comments. It can be anything. Ancient history, deep-time geology, lost civilizations, ocean mysteries, space, human evolution, or the strange details of everyday life that most people never stop to think about. If you've got a topic you want a calm, documentary-style breakdown of, I genuinely love to hear it. Tonight, we're traveling back to one of the most iconic places in human history. Ancient Egypt. Not the Egypt of movie myths and exaggerated legends, but the real Egypt. A land shaped by geography, by the movement of water, by long seasons of waiting and work. A civilization that lasted so long, it can feel less like a chapter of history and more like an entire world that existed alongside our own. And to understand how ancient Egypt began, we have to start with the thing that made it possible in the first place. A river. So settle in and enjoy tonight's lesson on the Nile, the gift of life. Chapter 1. The Nile, the gift of life. If you could travel back in time and hover above Northeast Africa thousands of years ago, the first thing you would notice is how sharp the contrast is. To the east and west, there is desert. Not just dry land, but an environment that feels permanent in its harshness. Sand, rock, heat, and a horizon that seems to go on forever. It is a landscape that resists settlement. It punishes mistakes. It does not forgive people who arrive unprepared. But cutting through that harshness, like a living vein, there is green. A narrow strip of fertile land running through a world of sand. That strip is Egypt in its earliest and most essential form, and at the center of it all is the Nile River. The Nile is not simply a river that happens to pass through Egypt. The Nile is the reason Egypt exists at all. It is the foundation of its agriculture, its economy, its population, its religion, and even its imagination. Without the Nile, there is no ancient Egypt. And what makes the Nile so powerful is not only that it provides water, but that it provides predictability. Because for most of Egypt's history, the Nile followed a rhythm. A seasonal rise and fall that shaped the lives of millions of people across centuries. The Nile begins far to the south, fed by rain systems and highlands that ancient Egyptians never fully understood in scientific terms, but deeply respected. They didn't have meteorology. They didn't have satellite images or rainfall maps, but they had observation and memory, and a deep awareness that the river's behavior was tied to forces beyond their immediate control. Every year, the Nile would swell. It would rise beyond its banks and spill outward onto the floodplain. It wasn't always gentle, and it wasn't always equal, but when it behaved as expected, it did something extraordinary. It renewed the land. The floodwaters carried silt. Fine particles of rich soil, transported downstream, then deposited across the fields as the water receded. This natural fertilization created farmland that could be used again and again, season after season, without being exhausted in the way many other ancient agricultural systems were. In a world where farming could be fragile and uncertain, this was a miracle, and the Egyptians knew it. To them, the Nile was not just a resource, it was a gift. It was a blessing that arrived on time, year after year, making life possible where it otherwise would not be. This is why ancient writers, even outside Egypt, describe the civilization with a simple phrase. Egypt is the gift of the Nile, but that phrase, while true, can still sound too neat, too poetic, too easy. Because the Nile did not create Egypt automatically. People did, and those people had to learn how to live with the river. They had to learn its moods, its timing, its dangers, and its opportunities. The earliest Egyptians were not living in a unified kingdom with pyramids and temples. They were living in small communities, villages, clusters of families who depended on the land, the river, and each other. They fished, they hunted, they gathered plants, and as agriculture developed, they began to plant crops and keep animals in a more organized way. Wheat and barley became staples. Flax was used for linen. Vegetables and fruits were cultivated in gardens. Cattle, sheep, and goats became part of daily life, and the river itself provided fish and birds, along with transportation and trade. because the Nile was also a highway. In a land where the desert made travel difficult and dangerous, the river offered a route that connected communities from north to south. Boats could move people, food, tools, and stone. Over time, that movement created communication, shared ideas, shared customs, and eventually shared identity. But before Egypt became Egypt, it was a collection of regions with their own local leaders and traditions. One of the most important divisions was geographical. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. To modern ears, that sounds backwards. Upper should be north, right? But the terms are based on the Nile itself. The river flows from south to north, descending toward the Mediterranean Sea. So Upper Egypt is the southern region, closer to the river's source. Lower Egypt is the northern region, where the Nile spreads out into the wide delta. And these two regions were different. Upper Egypt was narrower, more confined by desert cliffs and hills. The settlements there hugged the river closely, and the landscape could feel tight and linear. Lower Egypt was broader and wetter. The delta was a maze of branches and canals, with rich farmland and more open space. Both regions depended on the Nile, but they developed different cultural traits and political centers. They also developed competition. And competition in ancient societies often becomes conflict. But the Nile, again, changes the story, because while it could divide regions, it could also bind them together. As populations grew, managing water became more important. Irrigation systems developed. Canals were dug, fields were organized, grain had to be stored, labor had to be coordinated, and coordination requires leadership. In the earliest stages, that leadership might have looked like a respected elder, a local chief, or a small council. But over generations, leadership became more formal, more powerful, more centralized, especially as villages grew into towns, and towns grew into city-states. And once you have multiple city-states along the same river, sharing the same lifeline, the question becomes unavoidable. Who controls the Nile? Not the entire river, of course, but the key stretches. The fertile land, the trade routes, the storage centers, the religious sites. Control meant stability, control meant wealth, control meant survival, and the geography of Egypt is unusually strict. Unlike regions with many rivers, forests, and scattered fertile zones, Egypt's good land is concentrated. It is narrow, it is defined. That means populations are concentrated too. People lived close together, not because they wanted crowded cities, but because the land demanded it. You could walk only a short distance from a thriving field to a dead desert. That boundary did something important to the Egyptian mind. It created a sense of order, a feeling that the world had clear lines between safety and danger, between life and death, between abundance and emptiness. The green land by the Nile was life. The desert was the opposite. Even their language reflected it. They had terms for the black land and the red land. The black land was the fertile soil, dark with silt, where crops grew. The red land was the desert, harsh and barren, associated with chaos and threat. This wasn't just farming vocabulary, it was philosophy, because the Egyptians did not separate nature from meaning. They did not see the landscape as neutral. The land itself was part of the cosmic story. And that story, in Egyptian thought, was about balance, order versus disorder, stability versus collapse, life sustained by rhythm. This is where we begin to see the earliest roots of what later Egyptians would call Ma'at. Ma is often translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, but it's bigger than any single word. It is the principle that the universe is supposed to function in balance, and that human society has a duty to maintain that balance. In later centuries, pharaohs would claim that their purpose was to uphold Ma'at, to keep the world stable and aligned. But even before pharaohs, even before temples, the Nile was teaching people this idea. The flood came, then it receded. Planting followed flooding, harvest followed planting, storage followed harvest. Everything had a place, everything had timing, and when that timing broke, the consequences were immediate. If the Nile flooded too little, crops failed. Hunger spread, stability cracked. If the Nile flooded too much, fields were destroyed, homes were damaged, and people suffered. The river was generous, but it was not controllable. So the Egyptians lived with a kind of respectful dependence. They planned their lives around something that could not be negotiated with. And in that dependence, religion began to form. Not religion as a separate institution, but religion as the natural result of living beside a force that decided whether you lived or died. They developed stories and deities to explain what they saw, to give meaning to patterns. In time, the Nile itself would be associated with gods and sacred power. Flooding could be seen as divine favor. The fertility of the land could be seen as the result of cosmic harmony. And when we later hear about Egyptian gods connected to life, death, and rebirth, we should remember that the Nile was showing them rebirth every year. The land looked dead before the flood. Then it was submerged. Then it emerged again, renewed. Green returned. Life returned. It would feel like a phase, a crossing, a waiting, a transformation. This is one reason why ancient Egypt became so obsessed with continuity, with preservation, with ensuring that life could continue beyond the visible world. But that is later. For now, we are still in the beginning, in the slow forming of a civilization that does not yet know what it will become. What matters in this earliest stage is that the Nile created conditions that were rare in the ancient world. Reliable food production, concentrated population, a natural transportation route, clear geographic boundaries, and a rhythm that encouraged organization. All of those things pushed Egyptian society toward complexity, toward specialization. Because once you have consistent food, not everyone has to farm all the time. Some people can become craftsmen, some can become builders, some can become traders, some can become soldiers, some can become administrators, and some can become scribes, the record keepers who would one day preserve Egypt's voice in ink and stone. This is the quiet power of agriculture. It doesn't just feed people, it creates the surplus that allows a society to build things that are not strictly necessary for survival. Art, government. The Nile was not just a river that watered crops, it was an engine that produced civilization, and as the centuries moved forward, the settlements along its banks began to grow in ambition. They began to compete. They began to unify. They began to imagine permanence. And when humans begin to imagine permanence, they begin to build in stone, they begin to create kings, they begin to write history. But none of that happens without the first, simplest truth. A strip of green land in a sea of desert. A river that rose and fell like a heartbeat. A flood that left behind black soil and the promise of another year. That is where ancient Egypt begins. Not with pyramids, not with curses, not with golden masks. With people who learned how to live inside the rhythm of a river, and in doing so, created one of the longest-lasting civilizations the world has ever seen. And in the next chapter, we'll follow that development forward, from scattered communities to early kings, from regional power to national identity, from the Nile's rhythm to the first unification of Egypt. Because once the river made life possible, the next question became inevitable. Chapter 2, the first kings and the unification of Egypt. Long before Egypt became a land of pyramids and towering temples, it was something quieter, smaller, and more fragmented. It was a ribbon of settlements stretched along the Nile. Villages became towns. Towns became local centers of trade and authority, and over time those centers became political powers, not in the modern sense of nations with borders and flags, but in the ancient sense, communities with leaders, armed followers, religious traditions, and control over resources. At first, those communities may not have thought of themselves as part of a single civilization. They were simply people living where life was possible, doing what survival required, and building customs that made sense in their own region. But history has a way of tightening the circle. As populations grew and competition increased, the Nile stopped being only a lifeline. It became something else, a prize. Because control of the Nile meant control of food. Control of food meant control of labor. Control of labor meant power. And power, once it exists, tends to expand. To understand how Egypt became unified, we need to understand what Egypt looked like before unification. It was divided into two major regions. Upper Egypt, in the south, was narrow and enclosed. The Nile there ran through tighter terrain, bordered by cliffs and desert edges. Settlements were lined up along the river like beads on a string. Travel north and south was direct, and communities could stay connected through the waterway. Lower Egypt in the north was wide and sprawling. The Nile broke into branches, spreading into the delta before meeting the Mediterranean Sea. This region had richer farmland in many areas, easier access to trade routes, and a geography that felt more open. These regions were not just different in landscape. they developed different identities, different symbols, different power centers, and eventually different kings. This period, before Egypt's dynasties begin in the traditional historical record, is often called pre-dynastic Egypt. It spans thousands of years, and much of it is still incomplete to us. Archaeology gives us fragments: pottery, graves, tools, carvings, early artwork. But even in fragments, the direction of the story is clear. Egypt was moving toward unification. The question was how, and who would make it happen? In the late pre-dynastic period, Upper Egypt began to show signs of growing strength. Its leaders controlled long stretches of the Nile, and that control mattered. The river acted like a corridor of influence. If you controlled the corridor, you could move goods, gather followers, and project power. Several important settlements emerged in Upper Egypt as political and religious centers. One of the most significant was Nechin, known to the Greeks later as Hierakonpolis. It was a place of early kingship, a site with rich burials and evidence of elite power. In some ways, it represents a turning point, leadership shifting from local authority to something closer to monarchy. These early rulers were not pharaohs in the grand image we associate with Egypt, but they were moving in that direction. They were becoming symbols as much as they were individuals. And symbols matter, because they are how power becomes permanent. A strong ruler is dangerous, but temporary. A strong ruler who becomes a sacred figure is something else entirely. That is the beginning of the Egyptian state. But to build a state, you need more than charisma and violence. You need legitimacy, and you need organization. That means administration. It means taxation, even if it isn't called that. It means collecting grain, redistributing food, managing irrigation projects, directing labor, and enforcing order. It also means a shared belief that this system is the way the world is supposed to work. In Egypt, the earliest form of that belief seems to have formed around the idea that the king was not just a leader, but a mediator between human society and the cosmic order of the universe. Later, Egyptians would describe their kings as upholders of Ma'at, the balance that kept the world from sliding into chaos. But even in the earliest stages, you can see the outline of this thinking. The land is narrow, the desert is close, the river is essential, stability is everything, and the person who maintains stability becomes sacred. Now, Lower Egypt had its own leaders, its own centers, and its own culture. The delta was rich and strategically valuable. It connected Egypt to the Mediterranean world and to trade networks that could reach outward into the Levant and beyond. It is likely that Lower Egypt had powerful local rulers who controlled their own territories and competed with each other. So unification was not inevitable in the sense of being peaceful or natural. It was inevitable because it was useful. A unified Egypt would mean coordinated control of the Nile's agricultural system. It would mean stronger defense against outside threats. It would mean better control of trade, and it would mean that one authority could enforce stability over a long stretch of land. But to unify two regions, you need a ruler strong enough to do it. And that ruler needs a story. This is where we reach one of the most famous early artifacts in Egyptian history. It is not a palette in the modern sense, but a carved ceremonial object. It shows a king, identified by the name Nama, depicted in scenes of domination and control. On one side, Nama is shown wearing the white crown, the crown of Upper Egypt, raising a weapon over an enemy. The pose is iconic. It becomes a visual formula repeated throughout Egyptian history. The king as conqueror, the king as protector, the king as the one who crushes chaos. On the other side, Nama appears with the red crown, associated with Lower Egypt. This is the important part. The imagery suggests that Nama is not only a king of one region. Whether Nama was the single person who unified Egypt, or whether the process was more gradual and involved multiple rulers, the palette represents something larger than a biography. It represents the idea of unification, one king, one land, one authority. And it is difficult to overstate how revolutionary that was, because a unified Egypt was not just a political structure. It was a new way of imagining identity. It meant that people living hundreds of miles apart could be part of the same system. They could share a king. They could share religious concepts. They could share symbols of statehood. This is when Egypt begins to look like the civilization we recognize, not yet in architecture or monuments, but in organization, in the concept of a single throne ruling a single land. In later Egyptian tradition, the king's titles would reflect this unity. The king would be described as the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. The imagery of two crowns would persist. The idea of the two lands would become foundational, not just as geography, but as a cosmic balance. Upper and lower, south and north, narrow and wide, valley and delta, two halves made into one. But unity always comes at a cost, because once you create a central authority, you create a system that depends on that authority continuing. It becomes a machine that must keep running. This means the early kings had to solve problems that earlier leaders never had to solve. How do you control distant regions? How do you prevent rebellion? How do you maintain food distribution during poor flood years? How do you enforce laws across hundreds of miles? How do you manage labor projects large enough to reshape the landscape? And how do you convince people, year after year, generation after generation, that this system is sacred? Egypt's answer was to merge government with religion so completely that separating them would be impossible. The king was not merely appointed. He was chosen by the order of the universe itself. He was not simply a human ruler. He was a necessary part of reality. This is why Egyptian kingship lasted so long. It became one of the most stable political ideas in human history, surviving wars, famines, invasions, and internal collapse. The office of the king could outlive individual kings, because it was not just a job, it was a cosmic role. But that stability required administration, and administration required record-keeping. This is where writing begins to take on real importance. In early Egypt, writing developed in part because the state needed it. Grain storage, labor organization, trade records, religious offerings, and royal authority all benefited from a system that could preserve information. Early hieroglyphic writing appears in these contexts, not as literature, not as poetry, but as control, names, numbers, lists, ownership, authority. The earliest writing in many civilizations begins like this. Not to tell stories, but to manage resources. And once a civilization can record resources, it can expand, because it can plan. It can project power forward in time. It can build a mindset that said the state could mobilize thousands of people, that the king could command labor, that the land itself could be organized for a greater purpose. This is the beginning of monumental Egypt, not yet the pyramids, but the conditions that make pyramids possible. A centralized authority, a religious framework that makes that authority sacred, an economy that can feed large numbers of workers, a geography that channels people into concentrated settlements, a river that acts as both lifeline and highway, and a political idea strong enough to hold it all together, a state, a civilization with a single ruler at its center. The kings of this early period would establish royal burial practices, strengthen administrative control, and begin shaping the traditions that later dynasties would inherit. And those traditions would become incredibly powerful. Because once a civilization believes its ruler is divine, it becomes capable of building things that seem impossible. It becomes capable of devoting immense effort to monuments that are not practical in a daily sense, but symbolic in a cosmic sense. Structures meant to last forever. Structures meant to proclaim order. Structures meant to defeat time itself. In the next chapter, we will enter the age where that ambition becomes visible on the horizon. The Old Kingdom. The era where Egypt's kings did not simply rule. They built. They turned stone into political power. They turned labor into eternity. And they created the first great monuments that would make ancient Egypt immortal in human memory. Because once Egypt was unified, the next question was no longer whether it could survive. The question became how it would prove its greatness. Chapter 3, The Old Kingdom and the Rise of the Pyramid Age. If you want to understand why ancient Egypt still feels larger than life, even thousands of years later, you have to step into the Old Kingdom. This is the era when Egypt becomes something unmistakable. Not just a functioning state, not just a unified land, but a civilization that believes in its own permanence. A civilization confident enough to carve its authority into stone, and confident enough to assume that stone will still be there long after its builders are gone. The Old Kingdom is often called Egypt's first great golden age, and it is here more than anywhere else that the world begins to recognize the Egypt that lives in the imagination. The Pyramid Age. But the pyramids did not appear out of nowhere. They were the result of a slow build-up of ideas, technology, organization, and belief. They were the visible outcome of something that had already formed beneath the surface. A centralized government, a divine kingship, an economy built on agricultural surplus, and a population that could be mobilized at scale. By the time the Old Kingdom begins, Egypt has already been unified for generations. The king is no longer an experiment. He is the center of reality. He is the living symbol of order, the one who maintains balance between human society and the universe itself. This belief is not a minor detail. It is the engine behind everything. Because if the king is divine, then his survival is not just a personal matter. It is a national matter. It is cosmic. The stability of Egypt depends on the king's strength, the king's health, and eventually the king's successful transition into the afterlife. That transition is what drives the Pyramid Age. The pyramids are not simply tombs. They are machines of eternity. They are built to ensure that the king continues to exist beyond death and that his continued existence keeps the world stable. In modern terms, that can sound like superstition, but in ancient terms it was logic, because the Egyptians lived in a world where order was fragile, where drought could mean famine, where political division could mean collapse, where outside threats could destroy everything that had been built. Stability was not something you assumed. Stability was something you protected, and the king was the symbol of that protection. So in the Old Kingdom, kings begin to build on a scale that is difficult to comprehend even today. Not because they were reckless, but because they were making a statement to their people, a statement to their rivals, a statement to time. The Old Kingdom spans several dynasties, traditionally beginning with the Third Dynasty. It is during this period that Egypt's royal building projects shift from earlier burial practices into something new, something geometric, something monumental, something that will define Egypt forever. But before the smooth-sided pyramids of Giza, there was a first major leap forward, a single structure that changes everything, the step pyramid of Djoser. Djoser was a king of the Third Dynasty, and his pyramid was built at Saqqara, near the ancient city of Memphis. It is often considered the first large stone monument in Egypt. That alone makes it significant, because building in stone at that scale is not a small change. It is a transformation in how a civilization thinks. Stone lasts. Mud brick decays, wood rots, stone endures. And by choosing stone, Djoser's reign makes a promise. This kingdom is not temporary. This kingship is not fragile. This will remain. The step pyramid is not yet the perfect pyramid shape. It looks like stacked layers rising upward like a staircase, and that is likely part of the symbolism. A structure that climbs toward the sky, creating a path upward, not just for the king's body, but for his spirit. The architect behind this project is traditionally identified as Imhotep, one of the most famous individuals in Egyptian history. Imhotep is remembered as a brilliant builder and thinker, and later Egyptians would even treat him with a kind of reverence. Whether every detail of that tradition is perfectly accurate is less important than what it represents. By the Old Kingdom, Egypt is producing specialists, people whose expertise becomes legendary, people who can design and manage projects that require precise planning, massive labor coordination, and long-term resource control. Because pyramids are not built by inspiration, they're built by logistics. The step pyramid complex at Saqqara is not just one building. It includes courtyards, temples, walls, and ceremonial spaces. It is a whole engineered landscape designed to serve the king in death and to project his authority in life. And once this step has been taken, Egypt does not go back. The kings that follow will build larger, smoother, more ambitious pyramids. They will refine the form, they will push the scale, and they will set the stage for the most famous pyramids in history. But to understand why the Old Kingdom could do this, we have to look at the society that supported it. Because pyramids are not the work of one king alone. They are the work of a system. At the center of that system is agriculture. The Nile floods, the land produces grain, and that grain can be stored. Stored grain is wealth. Stored grain is security. Stored grain is the ability to feed people who are not actively farming. That means you can support a workforce. You can support craftsmen. You can support quarry workers. You can support transport crews. You can support supervisors and scribes. And you can support the administrative machinery required to manage it all. This is why the Old Kingdom is often seen as a period of strong central control. The king's government was able to mobilize resources across the land. It could gather taxes, often in the form of grain and goods. It could direct labor during seasons when farming work was reduced. It could coordinate large-scale projects with thousands of workers. The popular image of pyramid construction often focuses on slavery, but the reality is more complex. Many workers were likely farmers who worked on state projects during parts of the year, supported by food rations and organized labor systems. This matters because it changes how we understand Egypt. The pyramids were not built by chaos. They were built by organization. An organization requires a state that is capable, stable, and respected enough to demand participation. That stability, again, is tied to the king. The Old Kingdom kings are often described as absolute rulers, but their power was not just personal. It was institutional. The royal court, the priesthood, the administrators, and the regional officials all formed a structure that kept Egypt functioning. But structures always have pressure points. And one of the most important pressure points in any early state is the balance between central authority and regional power. Egypt was divided into districts, later known as nomes, each with local officials who managed land, resources, and labor. These officials were part of the king's system, but they also had their own interests. In the Old Kingdom, the king's authority remained strong enough to keep this system unified, but the seeds of later problems were already present. Because once regional officials gain wealth and influence, they can become semi-independent, and once that happens, central control begins to weaken. But in the height of the Old Kingdom, Egypt's system works. It produces stability, it produces wealth, it produces monuments, and it produces a cultural confidence that becomes almost unmatched in the ancient world. This is also when Egypt's religious ideas become more formalized. The king is increasingly associated with the sun god Ra, and the idea of the king's divine nature becomes more explicit. The afterlife becomes more structured in concept, and the royal burial complex becomes a spiritual project as much as an architectural one. The pyramid itself becomes a symbol of cosmic order, a shape that rises from the earth toward the sky, reflecting light, reflecting permanence, reflecting the king's role as a bridge between worlds, and the construction of pyramids becomes a national expression of that belief. But we should not imagine the Old Kingdom as only pyramids and kings. It was also a society of ordinary people, farmers working fields, families raising children, craftsmen shaping stone and wood, scribes learning to write, merchants traveling along the Nile, priests conducting rituals, soldiers defending borders, all of them living inside a system that, from their perspective, was the normal structure of reality. The king ruled. The Nile flooded. The gods maintained order. The world continued. This worldview created a kind of psychological stability, a feeling that the universe had rules, and that those rules were enforced. But the Old Kingdom's greatest achievement is also its greatest vulnerability. Because when you build a civilization around the idea that the king is the source of stability, the entire system depends on the king's ability to maintain that stability. If the Nile fails, the king is questioned. If food becomes scarce, the king is questioned. If regional officials grow too powerful, the king is challenged. And if the state cannot respond, the idea of cosmic order begins to crack. The end of the Old Kingdom is still debated in detail, but it appears to involve a combination of factors: weaker central authority, regional fragmentation, and environmental stress that may have affected Nile flooding patterns. When that happens, the Pyramid Age begins to fade. Not because Egyptians stop believing in eternity, but because the state becomes less capable of funding and organizing projects at that scale. The great stone monuments remain, but the system that built them becomes unstable, and that transition is important because it shows that Egypt's greatness was not magic. It was the product of real conditions: a stable environment, a functioning administration, a centralized authority, a shared belief system. When those conditions weakened, Egypt entered a period of fragmentation and hardship. But even in collapse, Egypt did not disappear. It endured, it adapted, it rebuilt. And the memory of the Old Kingdom, the pyramids, became something like a national legend, a standard of greatness that later rulers would look back on and try to match. Because once a civilization has built something that seems eternal, it becomes part of its identity. Even when times are hard, Even when unity breaks, even when power shifts, the pyramids remain, and they continue to speak silently across the centuries. In the next chapter, we will move closer to the most famous site of all, Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, and the reality behind the myth, because the world often treats these monuments like mysteries, like they are beyond human explanation. But the truth is both more grounded and more impressive. They were built by human beings, with planning, with labor, with belief, and with a civilization strong enough for a moment in time to command the resources of an entire nation for the purpose of eternity. Chapter 4. Giza, the Great Pyramid, and the reality behind the myth. There are places in the world that feel almost detached from history, as if they exist outside time. The Giza Plateau is one of them. Even today, with modern Cairo spreading nearby and highways cutting across the landscape, the pyramids still rise out of the desert with a kind of calm dominance. They do not look like ruins. They look like statements, like something meant to last. And that is exactly what they were. The pyramids at Giza are not just monuments. They are the peak expression of the Old Kingdom's power, organization, and belief. They represent a moment when Egypt had the confidence and capability to build on a scale that few civilizations have ever matched. And among them, one structure stands above all the rest: the Great Pyramid. Built for the King Khufu, it is the largest of the three major pyramids at Giza. And for thousands of years, it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth. That fact alone should reshape how we think about it. Because the Great Pyramid is not just impressive by ancient standards. It is impressive by any standard. But the world has a habit of turning the Great Pyramid into a mystery, as if the only way to explain it is to assume something supernatural, lost, or impossible. That instinct says more about us than it does about the Egyptians. The reality is that the Great Pyramid was built through human effort, human planning, and a system strong enough to make it happen. It is not a puzzle that can't be solved. It is a project that can be understood. But to understand it, we have to stop looking at it as a single object and start looking at it as the center of an entire engineered landscape. Because the pyramid is only one part of the complex. It was built with a mortuary temple, causeways, smaller pyramids, boat pits, and supporting structures. The pyramid was the focal point, but the complex was the machine. A machine designed to preserve the king's identity, protect his body, and ensure his successful transformation into the afterlife. The Great Pyramid was built during the 4th dynasty, a period often considered the height of pyramid construction. This dynasty produced not only Khufu's pyramid, but also the pyramid of his son Khafre and the pyramid of his successor Menkaure. Together they form the famous trio at Giza, but each one is not simply a copy of the others. Each one reflects a specific moment in Egypt's political and religious development, and each one required immense resources. To build them, Egypt needed stone, a lot of stone. The core of the pyramids was made from local limestone, quarried nearby, but the outer casing, the smooth layer that once covered the pyramids and made them shine in the sun, was made from finer white limestone, much of it transported from quarries farther away. And then there was granite, used in key internal chambers. Granite is harder, heavier, and more difficult to work with. Transporting it required coordination on a national scale. This is where the Nile comes back into the story, because stone does not move easily across desert terrain, but it can move by water. The Nile allowed Egypt to transport massive quantities of stone by boat. During certain seasons, when the water levels were high enough, transportation was more efficient. This is why pyramid building is not only an architectural achievement, it is a logistical achievement. It is an achievement of supply chains, labor organization, and state planning. The Great Pyramid was not built by one group of workers improvising as they went. It was built by a civilization capable of long-term project management. Thousands of workers were involved, not all at once, and not all in the same role, but across the years of construction. Quarry workers cut stone. Transport crews moved it. Skilled craftsmen shaped blocks and built internal chambers. Engineers planned alignments and angles. Supervisors organized labor. Scribes recorded deliveries and rations. And behind all of this was a system that could feed and support a large workforce. This is one of the most important realities behind the myth. The pyramids were built by a functioning society. a society with agriculture strong enough to create surplus, a society with administration strong enough to direct that surplus, a society with belief strong enough to justify the project. For a long time, the popular story was that pyramids were built by slaves. That image is dramatic and easy to repeat, but it oversimplifies what the evidence suggests. Many of the workers were likely not enslaved in the way we imagine, but were part of a labor system that included seasonal workers, skilled specialists, and permanent crews. Archaeological evidence points to organized worker communities near the pyramid sites, with food supplies, housing, and a structured workforce. It was dangerous. It was exhausting, but it was not random. It was a national effort, and that national effort was built on something deeper than force. It was built on the idea that the king's eternity mattered to the stability of the world. To Egyptians, the king was not just a man, he was a sacred role, a living pillar of order. So the pyramid was not simply a tomb, it was a guarantee that the king would continue and that Egypt would remain stable. This is why the Great Pyramid is not decorated internally the way later tombs would be. Its internal passages and chambers are stark, functional, designed for security and permanence rather than storytelling. Later periods would fill tombs with painted scenes and inscriptions, but in Khufu's time, the pyramid itself was the statement. Its size was the message. Its geometry was the proof. Its endurance was the promise. One of the most striking features of the Great Pyramid is its precision. The pyramid is aligned remarkably closely to true north. Its base is nearly square. Its sides were once smooth and bright. That level of precision does not require advanced technology beyond human capability, but it does require careful measurement and planning. The Egyptians had surveying tools. They had experience building large structures. They had generations of architectural development behind them. And they had a culture that valued order and alignment, not just for engineering reasons, but for religious reasons. Because a pyramid is not only a building, it is a symbol, a shape that connects earth and sky, a form that reflects stability and cosmic structure. It is also a kind of frozen sunrise. Some scholars suggest the pyramid shape may be connected to the Benben, a sacred mound associated with creation myths and solar worship. In these myths, creation begins with a mound rising out of primordial waters. The pyramid rises out of the desert like that mound, solid and unmoving, as if it is the first piece of land to emerge from chaos. Whether or not every builder thought in those terms, the symbolism fits perfectly with Egyptian religion. Order rising from disorder, stability rising from uncertainty, a king rising into eternity. Next to the Great Pyramid stands the Pyramid of Khafre. Khafre's pyramid appears taller from certain angles because it sits on higher ground and because part of its casing stones still remain near the top, giving a glimpse of what the pyramids once looked like when they were fully covered in smooth limestone. Khafre is also closely connected to one of the most famous monuments at Giza, the Great Sphinx. The Sphinx is a massive statue with the body of a lion and the head of a human, carved from limestone bedrock. It sits as a silent guardian, facing outward toward the horizon. Its meaning has been debated for centuries, but its symbolism is clear: power, protection. Royal authority fused with the strength of the natural world. The lion is a symbol of dominance, of control, of kingship. The human head represents intelligence, identity, and rule. Together, the Sphinx becomes a statement that the king is not only human, he is something more. A being who stands between nature and civilization, between chaos and order. And this, again, is the real purpose of the Giza complex. Not just to bury kings, but to project kingship as eternal, to make authority visible, to turn religion into landscape, to create a physical environment that tells every person who sees it the same message. The king is powerful, the king is sacred, the king's rule is permanent, and Egypt is stable. The third pyramid, built for Menkaure, is smaller but still monumental. Its scale may reflect changes in resources, political priorities, or religious emphasis, but it remains part of the same tradition. And together, the three pyramids mark the high point of the Old Kingdom's monument building era. But what happens after a high point is often overlooked. Because the pyramids at Giza feel like a climax, and in many ways they are. After this era, pyramid building continues, but the scale and perfection of Giza are never quite matched in the same way again. The state changes, the economy changes, power becomes more distributed, and the old kingdom's centralized system begins to weaken, but the pyramids remain. And that is why the myths grow around them. Because when a structure outlives its builders by thousands of years, people stop seeing it as a product of labor and start seeing it as a product of mystery. But the real story is more human than mystery. The pyramids are proof that ancient people were not primitive. They were organized, they were intelligent, they were capable of planning across decades. They were capable of building for eternity. And when you stand at Giza, even in your imagination, the feeling you get is not confusion. Recognition that human beings, given stability, belief, and purpose, can create things that defy time. Religion, the gods, the temples, and the Egyptian view of the universe. Because pyramids are not just engineering, they are theology and architecture. And to truly understand Egypt, we have to understand what they believed the universe was, how it worked, and why their entire civilization was built around keeping it in balance. Chapter 5, Gods, Temples, and the Egyptian view of the universe. To an ancient Egyptian, the world was not a random place. It was structured, it was ordered, it had rules. And if those rules were followed, life continued. The Nile flooded, the land produced grain, families ate, children grew, and society remained stable. But if those rules were broken, the world could slide into chaos. A failed flood could mean famine. A political collapse could mean violence. An invasion could mean the end of everything. So the Egyptians built their civilization around a single core belief. Order must be maintained. This is the foundation of Egyptian religion, and it explains why religion in Egypt was not a private matter or a separate part of life. Religion was life. It shaped government. It shaped law. It shaped art. It shaped architecture. It shaped how people understood the sun rising, the river flooding, the seasons changing, and the fact that human beings die. The Egyptians did not think of the universe as a machine. They thought of it as a living system, a system held together by balance, and the name they gave to that balance was Ma'at. But even as a goddess, Ma'at was bigger than a personality. She represented the structure of reality itself: truth, justice, harmony, balance, the correct functioning of the cosmos. If Ma'at was present, the world worked. If Ma'at collapsed, the world broke. This is why Egyptian kingship was sacred. The king's job was not only to rule people. The king's job was to uphold Ma'at, to keep the universe stable, to prevent chaos from taking over. And chaos, in Egyptian thought, was not just a metaphor. It was a real force. A threat that existed at the edges of the world, in the desert, in storms, in foreign lands, in disorder and rebellion, in the darkness that came each night when the sun disappeared. This is where the Egyptian gods come in. Because the gods were not distant beings who lived in a separate spiritual realm. The gods were the forces that made the world function. They were the personalities of nature, time, life, death, and power. They were not always gentle. They were not always moral in the way modern people might expect. And if you wanted stability, you needed a relationship with them. At the center of Egyptian religion was the sun, not only because the sun gives light and warmth, but because the sun was the clearest example of order. It rose, it crossed the sky, it set, it returned again, day after day, year after year. To the Egyptians, this was not just physics. It was proof that the universe was governed by a pattern. The sun god, in many forms, became central. Ra is one of the most famous. Ra was the sun as a divine being, traveling across the sky in a solar boat. In Egyptian myth, Ra's journey did not end at sunset. At night, he traveled through the underworld, facing dangers and chaos, and then rose again at dawn. This daily cycle became a cosmic drama. Every sunrise was a victory. Every dawn was a renewal of order. Every night was a reminder that chaos was always waiting. This is why Egyptian religion can feel repetitive in its themes, because life itself is repetitive. The Nile floods, the sun rises, the seasons return, people are born, people die, and the question is always the same. Will the cycle continue? Egyptian religion answers that question with ritual, with temples, with offerings, with kingship. And it was instruction. It told you how the world worked. It told you what mattered. It told you what forces had to be respected. Some gods were connected to kingship and power. Horus, the falcon god, is one of the most important. Horus represents kingship, the sky, and divine rule. The king was often seen as the living Horus, the embodiment of Horus on earth. This made kingship sacred by definition. If the king is Horus, then loyalty to the king is not only political, it is cosmic. And the story of Horus is deeply connected to another major myth, the story of Osiris. Osiris is the god of the dead, the underworld and rebirth. In myth, Osiris is killed and dismembered, and his wife Isis searches for his body, restores him, and brings him back in a transformed state. Their son, Horus, grows up and battles the forces that caused Osiris's death, restoring rightful order. This story is not just a family drama, it is a myth about stability, a myth about the threat of chaos, a myth about death and renewal. Death is a transition. If order can be restored after murder and destruction, then order can be restored after death. This is one reason why Egyptian burial practices became so detailed and so serious. Because the Egyptians did not treat the afterlife as a vague idea. They treated it as a real continuation of existence. But continuing existence required preparation, it required protection, it required knowledge, it required ritual, and it required the help of gods. This is where Anubis enters the story. Anubis, often depicted with the head of a jackal, is associated with mummification and funerary rituals. Jackals were seen near cemeteries, so the image makes sense. Anubis became the guardian of the dead, the one who oversees the preservation of the body and the passage into the afterlife. Later, Egyptian belief includes the famous idea of the weighing of the heart. In this judgment, the heart of the dead is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, it fails. If it is balanced, the person may pass into the afterlife. This is not a religion focused only on fear. It is a religion focused on alignment, on living in balance with order, on becoming the kind of person whose heart does not betray them. And then there is Isis. Isis is not simply a goddess of magic or motherhood. She is one of the most powerful figures in Egyptian religion. She represents devotion, restoration, protection, and the ability to overcome chaos through persistence and intelligence. Her popularity grew over time, eventually spreading far beyond Egypt. Even in the Roman world, Isis was worshipped as a powerful goddess. That tells you something about Egyptian religion. It was not static. It evolved. It absorbed new ideas. It changed emphasis across centuries. But the core remained: protection against chaos. Now, where did Egyptians meet the gods? Not primarily in private prayer, but in temples. And the temple system is one of the most important parts of Egyptian civilization. Because temples were not just religious buildings, they were economic institutions, administrative centers, symbols of power, and physical anchors of Egyptian identity. A temple was considered the house of a god. The god's presence was believed to reside there in a sacred form, often represented by a statue kept in an inner sanctuary. Not everyone could enter the deepest parts of a temple. In many cases, only priests and the king had access to the inner sanctuaries. This is important because it shows how religion and hierarchy were fused together. The god was at the center. The king was the god's representative. The priests served the god. The people supported the temple system through offerings, labor, and loyalty, and the system reinforced itself. Temples owned land. They employed workers. They stored grain. They managed resources. They organized festivals. They distributed food. They were part of the state. In many ways, the temple system helped Egypt survive across centuries because it created institutions that could endure even when individual kings rose and fell. But temples also had another role. They were theaters of ritual because the Egyptians believed that the gods needed to be cared for. The gods were fed through offerings. They were honored through rituals. They were celebrated through festivals. These actions were not symbolic to Egyptians. They were functional. They were necessary. They were the maintenance work of reality. If rituals were neglected, order could weaken. Chaos could rise. So religion became a daily discipline, not just for priests, but for the entire society. Even ordinary people participated through smaller household rituals, local shrines, and community festivals. They might pray for health, for protection, for fertility, for safe childbirth, for a good harvest. Egyptian religion was not only about death, it was also about life, because life was fragile and the gods were everywhere. The Nile itself could be sacred, the land could be sacred, animals could be sacred. Certain creatures became associated with specific gods: cats with protection and domestic power, falcons with kingship, crocodiles with dangerous strength. It is theology, a visual language that connects the natural world to divine forces. But the most important thing to understand is that Egyptian religion was not a single uniform system in the way we might imagine modern religions. It was layered. Local towns had local gods. Regions had different religious traditions. Some gods rose in national importance depending on which city became powerful. Some gods merged with others. Some gods gained new forms and names. Religion shifted with politics. Politics shifted with history. And through all of it, the Egyptians continued doing the same essential thing. They kept the cycle intact. They honored the forces they believed held reality together. They upheld Maat. They built temples as anchors of stability. And they placed their king at the center of the cosmic system. Because to the Egyptians, a civilization was not just a group of people living together. A civilization was a living structure that had to be maintained, and religion was the blueprint for that maintenance. In the next chapter, we step away from kings and gods and monuments, and we look at the lives of the millions of people who made Egypt real. The farmers who worked the fields, the craftsmen who shaped stone and wood, the scribes who recorded grain and taxes, the families who lived, loved, struggled, celebrated, and survived. Because ancient Egypt was not only built by pharaohs, it was built by ordinary people living ordinary days, inside one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever known. Chapter 6. Daily Life in Ancient Egypt. When most people picture ancient Egypt, they see the big things. Pyramids rising out of the sand, gold masks and buried treasure, pharaohs seated on thrones, giant temples carved with gods and kings. But the truth is, those things were only possible because of something quieter and far more common. Ordinary life. Because ancient Egypt was not built only by pharaohs. It was built by farmers who woke up before sunrise, by mothers who carried water and raised children, by craftsmen who shaped stone, wood, and metal with patient skill, by scribes who kept records, by fishermen who worked the river, by laborers who hauled grain, by servants, soldiers, and merchants. And when you step away from the monuments and look at the daily rhythm of the people, Egypt becomes more human, more real, more relatable, and in some ways, even more impressive. Because for thousands of years, people lived along the Nile and made this civilization function. Not for a few decades, not for a few centuries, but for an amount of time that stretches beyond the lifespan of most empires in world history. And they did it through routine, through work, through family, through survival, through a world where the river decided everything. For the majority of Egyptians, life began with the land. Most people were farmers. They lived in villages near the Nile, close enough to water crops, close enough to fish, and close enough to trade goods with nearby towns. Their homes were typically made of mud brick, because mud brick was practical. It was cheap, easy to make, and it worked well in the dry climate. Stone was used for temples and tombs, the things meant to last forever. Mud brick was used for the living, because the living needed shelter, not eternity. Inside these homes, life was simple but not empty. Families cooked food, stored grain, repaired tools, and worked constantly to keep everything running. Furniture was basic. Beds might be raised platforms. Storage might be baskets and pottery jars. Light came from oil lamps, water had to be carried, and if you lived in a farming village, your year was shaped by one force: the Nile cycle. When the floodwaters rose, fields were submerged. Farming paused, because planting could not happen until the water receded, but that did not mean work stopped. During the flood season, people might repair canals, work on state projects, transport goods, or contribute labor to construction. When the waters retreated, the soil was fresh and rich. That was the moment to plant. Crops like wheat and barley were the foundation. They became bread and beer, which were central to Egyptian diet. Beer was not a luxury drink in the modern sense. It was often safer than untreated water and was part of daily nutrition. Vegetables and fruits were also important. Onions, garlic, lentils, dates, figs, and other produce could be grown in gardens or gathered through trade. Meat was not necessarily a daily food for everyone, especially among the poor, but it existed. Fish was common for many communities near the river. Wealthier Egyptians could eat more meat and have more variety. And this difference between rich and poor is important. Ancient Egypt was not an equal society. It was hierarchical. At the top was the king. Below him were elite officials, priests and nobles. Below them were scribes, craftsmen and specialized workers. And below them were the majority, the farmers and laborers who made everything possible. But daily life still had shared experiences. People married. People had children. People worried about sickness. People worked until their bodies wore down. People celebrated festivals. People laughed, argued, prayed and hoped. In Egyptian art, we often see scenes of work. Harvesting, fishing, baking, brewing, building. These scenes can look like propaganda, a celebration of productivity, but they are also evidence. They show what mattered. They show what people did. They show the labor behind the civilization. And they show something else too, skill. Because Egyptians were not just workers, they were skilled workers. Craftsmanship in Egypt was advanced and deeply respected. Carpenters shaped wood into furniture and boats. Potters made storage jars, bowls, and everyday tools. Weavers made linen, one of Egypt's most important materials. Jewelry makers worked with gold and stones, producing designs that still look refined today. Stoneworkers were especially important because stone was the material of eternity. To carve stone, shape blocks, and build monuments required a level of precision and patience that could only come from training and experience. This is why Egypt could build what it built. Not because of magic, because of human expertise. And in the middle of this society, connecting everything, were the scribes. Scribes were not just people who could write. They were people who could control information. They recorded taxes. They tracked grain storage. They managed deliveries. They kept accounts of labor. They preserved royal decrees. They copied religious texts. They made the state possible. Literacy in Egypt was not widespread. It was an elite skill. That meant scribes held power, even if they were not kings or nobles. They could rise socially. They could become administrators. They could become priests. They could become officials. If you wanted a path upward in Egyptian society, becoming a scribe was one of the best options. But most people did not have that option. Most people lived close to survival, and survival was shaped by more than work. It was shaped by health. Ancient life was dangerous. Infections could kill. Childbirth could kill. A broken bone could become life-threatening. Parasites and disease were common, especially near water. The Egyptians developed medical knowledge and treatments, and they had doctors, but their medicine was a mixture of practical observation and religious belief. A person might receive a herbal remedy and also a protective spell. To the Egyptians, that was not contradictory. The physical and spiritual were connected, and that connection shaped how people lived. Religion was not only in temples, it was in homes. People wore amulets for protection. They prayed to local gods. They left offerings. They feared certain forces. They trusted others. They lived with the sense that the world was full of powers, visible and invisible, and that staying safe meant staying aligned with those powers. Family life mattered deeply. Marriage was common, and while elite marriages could be political, ordinary marriages were often practical partnerships. A household needed cooperation to survive. Women managed homes, food, children, and often participated in economic work such as weaving, brewing, and selling goods. Egyptian women generally had more legal rights than women in some other ancient societies. They could own property, make contracts, and inherit wealth, though social reality varied across time and class. Children worked early. They learned skills from parents. Education for elite boys could involve training as scribes, but for most children, life was apprenticeship through daily survival. And while Egypt could be harsh, it also had joy. People played games. They listened to music. They danced. They told stories. They celebrated festivals with food, drink, and community gatherings. These festivals were not only religious events, they were social release. Moments when the weight of work lifted and people could feel connected to something larger than themselves. And in a world where death was always close, those moments mattered, because death was not rare. It was expected. Life expectancy was lower than today, especially for the poor. Many children did not survive to adulthood. Many adults died from disease or injury. This is one reason why Egyptians became so focused on the afterlife. Not because they were obsessed with death for its own sake, but because death was unavoidable. So they treated it as part of life. They prepared for it. They tried to control it. They tried to make it less terrifying by giving it structure. Even ordinary people, when possible, would try to secure burial goods, amulets, or small offerings to help them in the next world. We often think of mummification as something only for pharaohs, but over time, burial practices spread. Not everyone could afford elaborate mummification, but the idea of preserving the body and preparing for the afterlife became deeply rooted. And this belief did something powerful. It made life feel continuous. It made death feel like a crossing rather than an end. And that, psychologically, changes everything. Because if you believe your actions matter beyond death, then order matters. Morality matters, reputation matters, legacy matters. Not only for the state, but for the individual. To live correctly was to align yourself with Maat. To live wrongly was to risk imbalance, in life and in death. And so daily life in Egypt was shaped by two forces at once, the practical and the cosmic, the daily work of planting, harvesting, cooking, building and raising children, and the constant awareness that life was part of a larger system, held together by balance, watched by gods, and guided by tradition. When you look at ancient Egypt this way, it becomes less like a distant myth and more like a living society, a place where people worked, worried, loved, and endured. A place where the majority lived without gold or monuments, but still carried the civilization forward through their routines. And that is the real foundation of Egypt's greatness. Not only kings, not only pyramids, but millions of ordinary lives, repeated across centuries, each one adding another layer to the civilization's long survival. In the next chapter, we move into one of the most powerful tools Egypt ever created: knowledge. The scribes who turned speech into permanence. Because once you can record the world, you can control it. And once you can control it, you can build empires, shape memory, and make your civilization speak across thousands of years. Chapter 7, Writing, Knowledge, and the Power of Scribes. If the pyramids were Egypt's proof of strength, then writing was Egypt's proof of control. Because stone monuments impress the eye, but writing shapes the mind. Writing is the difference between a society that remembers and a society that records. It turns spoken orders into permanent law. It turns scattered resources into managed systems. It turns individual lives into history. And in ancient Egypt, writing was not just a tool, it was power. To understand how important writing was, you have to picture Egypt as a living machine. Labor moving from villages into projects, stone moving from quarries into monuments, goods moving up and down the Nile, offerings being delivered to temples, the king issuing decrees. None of that can function at scale without information. They controlled the written world. They were the administrators of civilization. When we hear the word hieroglyphs, most people imagine beautiful symbols carved into stone walls. And yes, hieroglyphs are famous for that. They are one of the most recognizable writing systems in human history, filled with birds, eyes, snakes, hands, and sacred shapes. But hieroglyphs were not only art, they were language. And like all languages, they were flexible. They could represent sounds, whole words, and concepts. They could be used to record names, titles, prayers, laws, and history. They could be carved into stone to last forever. And they could also be written quickly, in more practical forms, for everyday administration. Because if you're managing a kingdom, you can't carve every grain record into a wall. You need speed, you need shorthand. This is where other writing styles appear, such as hieratic, a cursive form of Egyptian writing used for daily documents. Later, another script called demotic would become common for even more everyday use. But in the heart of Egypt's long history, the key point remains the same. Writing allowed the state to function. It allowed Egypt to become large, organized, and stable, and it created a class of people who became essential: the scribes. A scribe was not simply someone who could read and write. A scribe was someone trained in precision, someone trusted with records, someone who could calculate, measure, and account for resources, someone who could keep the state running. In a society where most people could not read, the ability to write was an advantage that could change your entire life. It could raise you out of manual labor. It could place you near the centers of power. It could make you valuable to officials, priests, and the royal court. Egyptian texts sometimes speak about the life of a scribe with pride, even arrogance. They describe physical labor as exhausting and punishing, while the scribe's life is presented as cleaner, safer, and more respected. And that makes sense, because in ancient Egypt, knowledge was not a luxury. Knowledge was a path upward. To become a scribe, you had to train. You had to learn hundreds of signs and their meanings. You had to learn grammar. You had to learn how to write neatly and consistently. You had to learn how to calculate numbers and manage records. You had to learn discipline, because writing was not only communication, it was authority. A written record could settle disputes. A written order could mobilize workers. A written list could determine who received food. A written contract could decide who owned land. In other words, writing could change reality. That is why scribes were respected, and that is why they were feared. But scribes were not the only keepers of knowledge. Egypt was also a civilization of builders, doctors, and engineers, and much of their knowledge was practical. How to build a canal, how to measure land after flooding, how to calculate grain storage, how to quarry stone, how to transport heavy loads, how to design temples and tombs, how to align structures with the sky. This knowledge did not always exist as written textbooks the way modern people imagine. But Egypt did preserve technical knowledge through documents, training, and tradition. Math was essential, because Egypt's land needed constant remeasurement. The Nile's flood could shift boundaries and erase field lines. If you wanted to tax land or assign ownership, you had to measure it again and again. That meant geometry, surveying, and calculation. Egyptian math was practical, focused on real problems, dividing food, calculating labor, measuring areas, and building structures. And their engineering achievements show how effective they were. The pyramids, the temples, the statues, and the irrigation systems were not accidents. They were the results of repeated skill. And behind repeated skill is knowledge. Medicine is another example. Ancient Egyptians treated injuries, illnesses, and disease with a combination of observation and ritual. They understood certain basic anatomy through experience, especially from mummification practices. They had knowledge of wounds, broken bones, infections, and some surgical techniques. They used herbal remedies, bandaging, and practical treatments. They also used spells and prayers. To modernize, this mix can look strange, but to Egyptians it was complete, because the physical and spiritual were not separate. A sickness could be a physical imbalance and also a spiritual disturbance. Treating both made sense. And even when their explanations were not scientific in the modern sense, their methods sometimes worked because they were based on real experience. Egyptian knowledge also extended into timekeeping. They tracked the seasons, they observed the stars, they aligned rituals and agriculture with the calendar. They understood patterns in the sky, not as astronomy in the modern sense, but as a way of anchoring time. This matters because Egypt was built on cycles. The Nile cycle, the sun cycle, the seasons. The idea of renewal. The calendar made those cycles manageable. It allowed planning. It allowed coordination. It allowed the state to function smoothly. And again, scribes were at the center of this. Because if the king wants a temple supplied with offerings, someone must record it. If a workforce is sent to quarry stone, someone must track rations. If taxes are collected from a district, someone must document it. If grain is stored for the future, someone must count it. If a king dies and a burial complex must be prepared, someone must organize resources. And writing also shapes memory, because what is written becomes official. It becomes the story that survives. This is why Egyptian kings carved their names into monuments. This is why they recorded victories and achievements. This is why they linked themselves to gods in inscriptions. They were not only building monuments, they were building legacy. A king's name carved in stone could last beyond his death. It could be spoken by future generations. It could be remembered. And to Egyptians, being remembered mattered. To be forgotten was a kind of second death. This is one reason why tomb inscriptions, prayers, and offerings were so important. They preserved identity. They kept a person connected to the living world. They kept a name alive. In this way, writing becomes more than administration. It becomes immortality. And that is where Egypt's writing system becomes deeply connected to religion. Words had power. To write a name was to preserve it. To write a spell was to make it real. To carve a prayer was to extend it across time. In Egyptian thought, the written word could shape reality. It could protect the dead. It could honor the gods. It could reinforce Maat. And this belief made writing sacred. Even the act of writing could feel like participating in the structure of the universe. Because those are the places where permanence mattered most. Temples were the houses of gods. Tombs were the houses of the dead. Both were meant to endure. Both were meant to preserve order. And writing was one of the tools that made endurance possible. But there is another side to this, because writing also creates distance between those who have knowledge and those who do not. Scribes could read the records, farmers could not. Officials could interpret laws, workers could not. Priests could read sacred texts, ordinary people could not. This creates a society where knowledge becomes concentrated, and concentrated knowledge becomes authority. So scribes were not only record keepers, they were gatekeepers. They were the people who turned the king's will into written law. They were the people who managed the flow of resources. They were the people who made the state function. And because of that, they were essential to Egypt's long survival. Egypt lasted as long as it did because it was not only powerful, it was organized. It had systems. It had records. It had bureaucracy. It had institutions that could continue even when individual rulers changed. Writing is what allowed that continuity. It gave Egypt the ability to think beyond the present moment, to plan for the next flood, to store grain for future years, to manage labor across seasons, to preserve history and religion, to build projects that took decades, to maintain temples that lasted centuries. In the next chapter, we move forward into a period where Egypt changes again. The old kingdom's strength fades, Egypt breaks apart, and then it rebuilds. The Middle Kingdom rises, and with it, a new version of Egypt emerges. A version shaped by lessons learned through collapse. A version more aware of fragility, more aware of what it takes to keep order alive. Because ancient Egypt's story is not only the story of greatness, it is also the story of survival. Chapter 8. The Middle Kingdom and Egypt's return to strength. If the Old Kingdom was Egypt at its most confident, the Middle Kingdom is Egypt at its most aware. Aware of what it means to fall apart. Aware of how fragile stability can be. Aware that order is not automatic, even in a land blessed by the Nile. Because between the pyramids of the Old Kingdom and the empire-building glory of the New Kingdom, there is a break in the story. A period when Egypt's unity fractures, when central power weakens, and when the country becomes something it had not been in generations. Divided. This period is often called the First Intermediate Period, and while it is sometimes described simply as an age of chaos, it is more complicated than that. It was not the end of Egyptian life. People still farmed, communities still functioned, local rulers still governed, temples still operated, and that disappearance mattered because the Egyptian worldview was built around unity, around Mad, around order holding the world together. So when Egypt fragmented, it was not just a political problem, it was a spiritual problem. It was a crack in the structure of reality itself. The causes of this fragmentation were not one simple event, but a combination of pressures. Over time, the Old Kingdom's centralized authority weakened. Regional officials gained more power and wealth. The ability of the state to command labor and resources declined. Environmental stress may have played a role too, as fluctuations in Nile flooding could create food shortages and instability. And when central power weakens, local power grows. This is a pattern seen across history. The king becomes less able to enforce authority across distant regions. Local governors begin acting independently. Competition grows. Conflict becomes more likely, and the country becomes a patchwork of rival centers. During this period, Egypt was no longer one solid machine. It was multiple smaller machines, each trying to survive and control its own territory. But Egypt did not stay divided forever, because the same geography that created fragmentation also created pressure toward unity. The Nile still ran through the land like a spine. Trade still depended on river travel. Agriculture still depended on large-scale coordination of water systems. And foreign threats still existed beyond the borders. A divided Egypt was weaker. A unified Egypt was stronger. Eventually, a new political center rose in the south, in Thebes, in Upper Egypt. Thebes was not always the heart of Egypt, but in this period, it became a rising power. Its rulers gained strength through regional alliances, military force, and political strategy. And through conflict with rival powers, Thebes began to reassert the idea of a united Egypt. This is where the Middle Kingdom begins, often dated to the reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II. The Middle Kingdom represents the return of centralized authority. The king once again becomes the center of the state. The country becomes one system again, not multiple competing systems. But the Middle Kingdom is not simply a repeat of the Old Kingdom. It is not Egypt going back to the way things were. It is Egypt learning from collapse. The rulers of the Middle Kingdom understood something their Old Kingdom predecessors may not have fully recognized. Unity is not guaranteed. It must be maintained. And to maintain it, the state must be stronger, more adaptive, and more engaged with the realities of governing. This is one reason why Middle Kingdom kings often appear more practical and more politically active than the distant, almost godlike image of Old Kingdom kings. They still claimed divine authority, but they also emphasized leadership, protection, justice, stability. They presented themselves as shepherds of the people, responsible for keeping the land safe and functioning. This shift in tone is important. It reflects a society that has experienced instability and does not want to return to it. The Middle Kingdom also becomes known for strengthening Egypt's administration. The bureaucracy becomes more developed. Record keeping becomes more extensive. The state becomes better at managing resources, taxation, and labor. Regional officials still exist, but the central government works to control them more effectively. This is a delicate balance, because the state needs local officials to manage distant regions, but it cannot allow them to become independent. So Middle Kingdom kings had to reinforce loyalty, monitor power, and maintain control without breaking the system. In many ways, the Middle Kingdom is a period of consolidation, a rebuilding of the state, a strengthening of institutions, a restoration of order. But it is also a period of cultural revival, because when stability returns, art and literature often flourish. Middle Kingdom Egypt produced some of the most famous Egyptian texts, including wisdom literature and stories that explore morality, identity, and the meaning of life. This is where Egypt's voice becomes more personal, more reflective, more aware of uncertainty. Some Middle Kingdom writings show a society thinking deeply about justice, about proper behavior, and about what it means to live in a world where chaos can rise again. This is not the tone of a civilization that believes it is invincible. It is the tone of a civilization that knows it is mortal and chooses stability anyway. The Middle Kingdom is also a period when Egypt expands its reach in practical ways. Trade becomes more organized and far-reaching. Egypt strengthens its connections to Nubia to the south, a region rich in resources including gold. Egypt builds forts and military installations to secure trade routes and control movement. This expansion into Nubia is not only about wealth, it is about security. The southern frontier mattered. If Egypt wanted stability, it needed control of the borders. The Middle Kingdom kings also paid attention to the Sinai Peninsula, where Egypt could access copper and other materials. Expeditions were organized to secure resources, showing a state capable of planning beyond its immediate agricultural base. This is what a strong Egypt looks like. Not only farming the Nile, but reaching outward, managing trade, securing resources, projecting power beyond the valley. And at the center of this renewed strength was a new dynasty that would become one of the most important in Egyptian history, the 12th dynasty. This dynasty is often seen as the height of the Middle Kingdom, and its rulers built a stable, effective government that held Egypt together for generations. Kings like Senusret I, Senusret III, and Amenemhat III are remembered for strengthening the state, expanding control, and building major projects. Senusret III in particular is often described as a strong and forceful ruler. He pushed Egypt's influence deep into Nubia, reinforced military control, and reshaped the relationship between the king and the provinces. His reign reflects a state that is no longer willing to tolerate fragmentation. This is Egypt with its lessons learned. But the Middle Kingdom's strength was not only military, it was also economic. One of the most important Middle Kingdom projects was the development of the Fayum region, a fertile area southwest of the Nile Valley. The state worked to improve irrigation and land use there, expanding agricultural production. This is another key point. Egypt's power always returns to water management. Control the water, control the food. Control the food, control the workforce. Control the workforce, control the state. The Middle Kingdom kings understood that building projects were not only about monuments, they were about infrastructure. They were about expanding the land's productivity. They were about making Egypt stronger in a practical sense. At the same time, temples continued to grow in importance. Religion remained the foundation of society, but it also became increasingly tied to the state's wealth and administration. Temples owned land, managed workers, and served as centers of economic power. This created another balancing act. The king needed temples to maintain religious legitimacy, but temples could also become powerful institutions in their own right. Managing that relationship was part of governing Egypt. The Middle Kingdom also saw changes in how the afterlife was imagined. In the Old Kingdom, the most elaborate afterlife beliefs were heavily centered on the king. The king's pyramid, the king's rituals, the king's transformation. But over time, access to afterlife concepts became broader. More ordinary people began to adopt practices and beliefs once associated mainly with elites. This does not mean everyone could afford the same burials, but it does mean that the spiritual world of Egypt became more widely shared. The afterlife was not only for kings, it was for people. But no period lasts forever. Even the Middle Kingdom, strong as it was, eventually faced decline. Internal weaknesses returned, leadership changed, regional tensions grew, and new external pressures emerged. Eventually, Egypt entered another period of fragmentation, often called the Second Intermediate Period. This time, one of the major forces in the story is the arrival of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos were not a single invading army in the simplistic sense, but a group of people from the eastern Mediterranean region who gained control over parts of Egypt, especially in the north. They introduced new technologies, including improvements in warfare such as horse-drawn chariots and new types of weapons. Their presence shows that Egypt, even with its natural defenses of desert and sea, was not isolated. It was connected to the wider world, and the wider world could push back. Egypt's response to this challenge would shape the next era, because the struggle to remove the Hyksos and restore full Egyptian control would fuel a new kind of kingship, a more militarized kingship. A kingship that does not only protect the land, but expands it. This is the transition toward the new kingdom. The age of empire. The age of famous pharaohs like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses II. But before we reach that, the Middle Kingdom deserves its place as one of Egypt's most important chapters. It is the era when Egypt proves that it can recover, that it can rebuild after collapse, that it can restore order after fragmentation, that it can strengthen its institutions and survive its own weaknesses. The Old Kingdom gave Egypt monuments. The Middle Kingdom gave Egypt endurance. And endurance is often the greater achievement, because it is easy to build when everything is stable. It is harder to rebuild when you know what it feels like to fall apart. The Middle Kingdom is Egypt looking at its own history and choosing unity again, choosing stability again. And in the next chapter, we will see what happens when that stability is paired with military ambition and international power. The New Kingdom. The era when Egypt becomes not only a civilization of the Nile, but a civilization that reaches outward, shaping the politics of an entire region. A kingdom that becomes an empire, and a people whose gods, kings, and monuments would become legendary across the ancient world. Chapter 9. The New Kingdom, Empire, War, and Famous Pharaohs. If the Old Kingdom was Egypt's age of monument building, and the Middle Kingdom was Egypt's age of rebuilding and consolidation, then the New Kingdom is Egypt's age of expansion. This is the period when Egypt becomes an empire, not just a powerful kingdom along the Nile, but a state that projects influence outward, across borders, into neighboring lands. It becomes militarized. Wealth floods in through conquest and trade. Temples grow larger. The royal court becomes more complex, and the names of certain rulers become so famous that they survive into modern culture almost unchanged. Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramses II. But behind those names is a larger story. A story about why Egypt became aggressive, how it maintained control, and what happens when a civilization built on stability begins to pull the wider world into its orbit. The New Kingdom begins after a crisis. Egypt had been weakened and divided during the Second Intermediate Period, with foreign rulers known as the Hyksos controlling parts of the north. The Hyksos introduced new military technologies, including horse-drawn chariots and improved weapons, and they exposed a hard truth. Egypt was not untouchable. Egypt could be infiltrated. Egypt could be ruled by outsiders. For a civilization built on the idea of order, that was unacceptable. So the early New Kingdom begins with resistance and reunification. The rulers of Thebes in the south fought to drive the Hyksos out and restore Egyptian control over the whole land. This conflict did more than remove foreign rulers. It changed Egypt's mindset. It created a new kind of kingship, a kingship that was not only sacred but military, a kingship that did not only preserve order within Egypt but pursued security beyond Egypt's borders. Because if Egypt wanted to remain safe, it could no longer rely on geography alone. It had to control the approaches, the routes, the borderlands, the regions that could become staging grounds for threats. This is how a kingdom becomes an empire, not always out of greed, but out of fear, out of the logic of security. The early New Kingdom pharaohs began expanding into Nubia in the south and into the Levant in the northeast. These regions were not empty. They had their own cultures, their own cities, their own rulers, but Egypt's power was rising and Egypt's army was becoming more organized and more capable. The chariot, in particular, became a symbol of this era. Fast, mobile, and devastating in battle, chariots allowed Egyptian forces to strike quickly and dominate open terrain. The Egyptian military evolved, and the king became the commander of that military. This is why New Kingdom art and inscriptions often show the pharaoh in battle, charging forward, drawing a bow, crushing enemies, standing tall in a chariot. It is propaganda, yes, but it is also evidence of a real shift. The king is no longer only the guardian of Maat through ritual. He is the guardian of Maat through force. And force brings wealth. Conquests brought tribute, gold, slaves, livestock, luxury goods, and control of trade routes. Temples benefited. The royal court benefited. Egypt became richer, and with wealth came building. The New Kingdom is the age of grand temples, especially in Thebes, which became one of the most powerful religious centers in Egyptian history. This is where the god Amun rises in national importance. Amun, often combined with Ara as Amun-Ra, becomes the dominant deity of the state. The priests of Amun grow wealthy and influential because the temple of Amun at Karnak becomes one of the greatest religious institutions in the ancient world. Karnak is not one building. It is a complex built over centuries, expanded by king after king, filled with columns, statues, obelisks, and sacred spaces. It is a physical demonstration of Egypt's power and devotion. And right beside it, connected by sacred processional routes, is the Luxor Temple, another major monument of the New Kingdom. This is Egypt at its peak. A strong army, a wealthy state, a powerful priesthood, a king who rules by both sacred authority and military success. But peaks are unstable places, because when wealth and power rise, so do internal tensions. One of the most famous rulers of the New Kingdom is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is significant because she ruled as a female pharaoh, and she did not rule as a hidden figure or a temporary caretaker. She took on the full royal role, including the titles and imagery of kingship. She is often depicted in traditional male pharaoh form, including the ceremonial beard in statues. This was not a disguise, it was a statement. The office of king was sacred and she claimed it fully. Hatshepsut's reign is known for stability and trade rather than major conquest. One of her most famous achievements is the expedition to Punt, a trading mission that brought back exotic goods such as incense, ebony, and other luxury materials. She also built one of the most stunning temples in Egypt. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, set against the cliffs near Thebes, is a masterpiece of design. Terraces, colonnades, and symmetry built into the landscape itself. Hatshepsut's reign shows that power in Egypt was not always expressed through war. It could also be expressed through prosperity, building, and diplomacy. But after her reign, Egypt's military expansion continued, especially under pharaohs like Thutmose III, often called one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings. Thutmose III led campaigns into the Levant, expanding Egypt's control and securing tribute. Under rulers like him, Egypt becomes a dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean world, and as Egypt expands, it becomes more connected to other major states. This is not a world of isolated kingdoms. It is a world of diplomacy, rivalry, trade, and shifting alliances. Egypt's kings exchanged gifts and letters with foreign rulers. They arranged marriages. They negotiated treaties. In many ways, the New Kingdom is Egypt becoming international, But the most dramatic internal shift of the New Kingdom comes under one pharaoh in particular, Akhenaten. Akhenaten is one of the most controversial figures in Egyptian history because he attempted something radical. He tried to reshape Egyptian religion. Akhenaten promoted the worship of the Aten, the sun disk, as a central divine force. In doing so, he reduced the importance of traditional gods, especially Amun, whose priesthood had grown extremely powerful. This was not just a spiritual change. It was political, because weakening Amun meant weakening the priests, and weakening the priests meant strengthening the king. Akhenaten moved the royal capital away from Thebes to a new city, often called Amarna by modern archaeologists. There, he built a new religious and political center aligned with his vision. This period is known as the Amarna period. It is marked by dramatic changes in art, too. The traditional stiff, idealized style of Egyptian royal imagery shifts into something more unusual. Figures appear with elongated features, softer lines, and scenes that feel more intimate. Akhenaten is often shown with his wife Nefertiti and their children in domestic scenes under the rays of the Aten. It is one of the most striking breaks in Egyptian cultural continuity, but it did not last. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt began restoring the old order. The traditional gods returned, the power of Amun returned, the capital shifted back, and Akhenaten's religious revolution was largely erased from official memory. This is where Tutankhamun enters the story. Tutankhamun is one of the most famous pharaohs in the world today, not because of his reign, but because of what was found in his tomb. His tomb was discovered in the modern era, with many of its treasures intact, including the famous gold mask. This discovery made Tutankhamun a household name. But in his own time, he was a young king in a difficult moment. He ruled during the restoration after Akhenaten's upheaval. His government worked to return Egypt to religious and political stability. He did not build the largest monuments. He did not lead the greatest conquests. But his name survives because his death left behind a time capsule, a preserved glimpse into royal burial wealth and craftsmanship. And that craftsmanship, again, is one of the New Kingdom's greatest achievements. The New Kingdom produced extraordinary art, jewelry, sculpture, and architecture. It also produced some of the most elaborate tombs ever made, especially in a place that becomes central to New Kingdom burial, the Valley of the Kings. Instead of pyramids, New Kingdom pharaohs were buried in hidden rock-cut tombs carved deep into the desert cliffs. These tombs were filled with texts and images meant to guide the king through the afterlife. This shift away from pyramids reflects changing strategies. Pyramids were visible, they were targets, they were impossible to hide. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings could be concealed, guarded, and protected, at least in theory. It was an attempt to preserve the king's body and treasures from tomb robbers, because by this time tomb robbery was a real and constant threat. Even sacred kings were not safe from human greed. And that reality forced Egypt to adapt. The New Kingdom reaches another peak under Ramses II. Ramses II is one of the most famous pharaohs in history, often called Ramses the Great. He ruled for a long time and built extensively. His name is carved across temples and monuments throughout Egypt. Ramses II fought major battles, including against the Hittites, another powerful empire of the ancient world. One of the most famous battles is the Battle of Kadesh, which Ramses promoted heavily in inscriptions. Whether the battle was a clear victory or not, Ramses used it as propaganda, portraying himself as heroic and unstoppable. And this is another key feature of the New Kingdom. The pharaoh's image becomes larger than life. The king becomes a public symbol, a figure whose victories, building projects, and divine favor are carved into stone for everyone to see. Ramses II also became part of one of the most important diplomatic achievements of the ancient world, a peace treaty with the Hittites. This reflects the reality of empire. Eventually, expansion hits limits, power meets power, war becomes costly, diplomacy becomes necessary. But even at its height, the New Kingdom was not invincible, because empire creates stress. It demands constant military readiness. It requires wealth to maintain armies and garrisons. It requires loyalty in distant regions. It creates internal competition over resources, and it creates dependence on strong leadership. Over time, the New Kingdom begins to weaken. Foreign pressures increase. Internal power struggles grow. The priesthood becomes more influential. Economic strain rises, and the empire that once expanded outward begins to contract. Egypt enters a long period of change where foreign powers will eventually dominate the region. But the new kingdom leaves behind something immense. It leaves behind temples that still stand. It leaves behind tombs filled with texts and art. It leaves behind famous names that still echo. And it leaves behind a version of Egypt that feels almost mythic, because it is the era when Egypt was not only surviving, it was ruling. In the next and final chapter, we will follow Egypt's long decline and transformation, the invasions, the foreign dynasties. It changes, it is absorbed into larger empires. But it never truly disappears, because even when the kings are gone, the monuments remain. The gods remain in memory, the writing remains in stone, and the world continues to look back at Egypt as if it was not just a civilization but a dream carved into the desert. Chapter 10, Decline, Invasions, Cleopatra, and the long afterlife of Egypt. Every civilization that lasts long enough eventually faces the same test. Not whether it can rise, but whether it can endure change, because power does not disappear all at once. It weakens, it shifts, it fractures, it gets absorbed into something larger. And sometimes, the world keeps the monuments, but forgets the people who built them. Ancient Egypt is one of the clearest examples of this. Egypt did not end with a single collapse. It did not fall in one dramatic night. It declined in stages across centuries, shaped by internal weakness and outside pressure. It was invaded, ruled by foreigners, reshaped by new empires, and transformed into something that was still Egypt, but no longer the Egypt of pharaohs and pyramids. And yet, even after the last pharaoh was gone, Egypt continued to exist as an idea, a symbol, a civilization that outlived its own political system. To understand this final chapter, we have to begin with the slow weakening that followed the new kingdom. At its height, Egypt had been an empire. It controlled territory in Nubia and the Levant. It had armies, chariots, trade networks, and enormous wealth flowing into temples and royal projects. But empires are expensive. They require constant defense. They require strong leadership. They require stable resources. And they require a society that can support the burden. Over time, Egypt's ability to maintain its empire declined. Foreign threats increased, including pressure from groups often referred to collectively as the Sea Peoples, along with other regional shifts that destabilized the Eastern Mediterranean world. Trade routes changed. Rival powers rose and fell. The balance of the ancient world began to tilt. At the same time, Egypt faced internal problems. The royal court became unstable. Succession could be contested. Economic strain grew. Corruption and local power struggles became more common. And perhaps most importantly, the central authority of the king weakened. This mattered because Egypt's entire system was built around the king as the anchor of order. If the king is strong, Egypt is stable. If the king is weak, the whole structure starts to loosen. During the late New Kingdom and the period that follows, the priesthood of Amun in Thebes gained enormous influence. Temples had land, wealth, and workers. Priests were not only religious figures, they were political and economic powers. In some periods, the priests of Amun held authority that rivaled the king. This created a divided system. A king might still rule, but real control could be shared, contested, or fragmented. Egypt entered what is often called the Third Intermediate Period, a time marked by political division, competing dynasties, and shifting power centers. Once again, Egypt becomes a land where unity is not guaranteed. And once again, that makes Egypt vulnerable. Because when a state is divided, foreign powers notice. Egypt's geography had always provided some protection. Deserts formed natural barriers. The Nile Valley was narrow and defensible. But Egypt was not isolated. It was connected to Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. And in a world of expanding empires, Egypt was valuable. It was wealthy. It was strategically located. It was culturally prestigious. And it was, at times, politically weak. This combination makes a country a target. Over the centuries, Egypt would be invaded or dominated by outside forces multiple times. One major phase of foreign control came from the Assyrians, who pushed into Egypt during a period of regional instability. Their influence did not last forever, but their presence showed how far Egypt had fallen from its imperial peak. Then came the Persians. The Persian Empire, one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, conquered Egypt in the 6th century BCE. Under Persian rule, Egypt became part of a much larger imperial system. This was a transformation. Egypt was no longer the center of its own world. It was now a province of someone else's world. But even under foreign rule, Egypt remained Egypt. The people still lived along the Nile. The temples still functioned. The language and traditions continued. The gods were still honored. Egyptian identity survived, even when Egyptian political independence did not. This is one of the remarkable things about Egypt. It was conquered many times, but it was never culturally erased. It remained itself through adaptation. And then came one of the most famous turning points in the story, Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, Alexander conquered Egypt as part of his campaign against Persia. To Egyptians, Alexander was not simply another invader. He was also an opportunity, a new ruler who could be framed as a liberator from Persian control. Alexander understood the importance of legitimacy in Egypt. He honored Egyptian religion, visited sacred sites, and presented himself in ways that fit Egyptian expectations of kingship. This was not just respect, it was strategy. Because in Egypt, legitimacy was everything. A ruler could not simply claim power by force. A ruler needed to fit into the cosmic structure, and Alexander, brilliant as he was, knew how to use symbolism. After Alexander's death, Egypt became the center of a new dynasty, the Ptolemies. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Greek in origin, founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt was ruled by Greek-speaking kings and queens, but they adopted many Egyptian traditions. They built temples in Egyptian style. They supported priesthoods. They portrayed themselves as pharaohs. This is where Egypt becomes one of the most fascinating cultural crossroads in ancient history. Greek language and ideas spread. Egyptian religion continued. New art forms developed. Trade and scholarship flourished. And one city in particular became a symbol of this new era: Alexandria. Founded by Alexander, Alexandria became a major center of learning and culture. It was famous for its library and its intellectual life. Scholars gathered there, texts were collected, and knowledge became a form of power. This is a different kind of Egyptian greatness. Not pyramids and temples alone, but scholarship and international influence. Egypt becomes a hub of the Mediterranean world. But the Ptolemaic dynasty was also unstable. It faced internal family conflict, political intrigue, economic pressures, and growing competition from a rising power to the west, Rome. Rome's influence spread across the Mediterranean, and as Rome grew stronger, Egypt's independence became more fragile. By the time we reach the last great figure of ancient Egypt, the world is changing fast. This figure is Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra is often remembered through a distorted lens, shaped by Roman propaganda and modern romantic myth. She is sometimes reduced to a story about beauty and seduction. But Cleopatra was not simply a romantic figure. She was a political ruler in an impossible situation. She inherited a kingdom under pressure, a dynasty weakened by internal conflict, a country that was still wealthy but vulnerable, and a Mediterranean world dominated by Rome's expanding power. Cleopatra's challenge was not only to rule Egypt, it was to keep Egypt independent. And to do that, she needed alliances. This is where her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony become historically significant. Not as gossip, not as drama, but as strategy. Rome was not a distant empire. It was the force deciding the future of the region. Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar helped secure her position, and after Caesar's death, her alliance with Antony became part of a larger struggle for control of Rome itself. But Rome's internal politics were ruthless, and eventually Cleopatra and Antony faced the power of Octavian, who would later become the Emperor Augustus. The conflict ended in defeat. Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE marks the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and with it, the end of pharaoh rule in Egypt. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The age of pharaohs was over, but Egypt did not vanish. It continued under Rome. Temples still stood, priests still performed rituals, people still lived by the Nile. But the center of power was no longer in Memphis or Thebes or Alexandria. It was in Rome. And over time, the ancient religious system that had defined Egypt for millennia began to weaken as new religious forces spread through the empire. Eventually, Christianity would become dominant in Egypt, and later Islam would reshape the region again. The language of hieroglyphs faded from use. The knowledge of how to read them was lost. Temples were abandoned or repurposed. Statues were buried under sand. And for centuries, ancient Egypt became a land of ruins, a land of half-remembered legends. Because even when the language was forgotten, the monuments remained. And monuments have a strange power. They pull people back. They demand explanation. They force memory. In the modern era, Egypt became one of the greatest archaeological obsessions in human history. European explorers and scholars began documenting temples and tombs. Expeditions searched for artifacts. Museums filled with statues, mummies, and carved stone. And then, in the 19th century, one breakthrough changed everything: the decoding of hieroglyphs. When scholars finally learned to read the writing again, Egypt began to speak in its own voice, not through rumors, not through Greek and Roman descriptions alone, but through Egyptian words, Egyptian names, Egyptian prayers, Egyptian history carved into stone. This was a revival of memory, and it changed how the world understood the past. Because it revealed something extraordinary. Egypt was not a civilization of mystery, it was a civilization of record. It documented itself. It preserved its identity. It spoke across thousands of years, waiting for someone to learn how to listen. And today, ancient Egypt still holds a grip on the human imagination, not only because of pyramids and mummies, but because Egypt represents something that human beings want to believe is possible. That a civilization can outlast its own people. That human work can resist time. That memory can survive. That order can be carved into the world. The pyramids still stand. Temples still rise from the desert. Statues still stare across the Nile Valley. Cleopatra, their stories are still told. Their monuments are still studied. Their civilization still feels close enough to touch, even though it belongs to a world that ended long ago. And that is the long afterlife of Egypt. Egypt did not simply die. It transformed. It was conquered, absorbed, and reshaped. But it never stopped being Egypt. Because Egypt's true power was never only military. It was never only wealth. It was never only monuments. Egypt's true power was its ability to create permanence, to build a world so structured, so symbolic, and so enduring that even after its political system vanished, it continued to live in human memory. And when you look at the Nile today, flowing through the same valley it has flowed through for thousands of years, you realize something simple and unsettling. The river is still there. The land is still there. The desert is still there. And the ruins are still there. A reminder that human beings can build for eternity, but also a reminder that eternity is never guaranteed. It has to be built. It has to be protected, and even then, time eventually wins. But ancient Egypt made time work harder than almost any civilization in history. And that is why, even now, late at night, in the quiet hours, we are still talking about it. Because some civilizations end, and some civilizations echo.